My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 68 years old, retired, widowed, and until recently, I believe I had done one thing right in life. I raised my son to become a good man. Daniel Bennett was my pride long before he became a doctor, long before the white coat, the framed degrees, and the polished smile he used on patients. I remember him as a skinny 12-year-old boy sitting at our kitchen table at 2 a.m. while I reheated leftover soup because he refused to sleep until he understood algebra. Back then, we had almost nothing. I drove trucks for 32 years while my wife Linda cleaned houses, even after arthritis twisted her fingers so badly she could barely hold a coffee mug. We skipped vacations, sold jewelry, refinanced our home twice, and drained every dollar of savings so Daniel could attend medical school debt-free. And we did it gladly because when you love your child, sacrifice feels like purpose. That illusion lasted until the Thursday morning I made a simple phone call. I was sitting alone in my kitchen drinking instant coffee when I called Daniel and asked when the opening ceremony was for his new clinic. There was a long silence before he finally said, "Dad, we already did it yesterday." At first, I thought I heard him wrong. I asked what he meant, and he calmly explained the event had already happened the previous evening. My stomach tightened as I realized nobody had invited me. Then Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, grabbed the phone and coldly said, "It was mostly investors and business associates, Harold. It wasn't really a family thing." I sat there speechless, staring at the faded wallpaper in my kitchen, while the silence in the room suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever carried in my life. For several seconds, I couldn't even respond. I just held the phone against my ear, while my mind tried to process what I had heard. This clinic existed because of our sacrifices. Every late-night truck route I drove through snowstorms, every double shift Linda worked cleaning strangers' bathrooms, every birthday we celebrated with cheap grocery store cake instead of presents. All of it helped build Daniel's future. And somehow, when the biggest moment of his career finally arrived, his own father became unnecessary. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly and said they had been very busy organizing everything. He told me not to take it personally. That sentence hurt more than the exclusion itself. People only say, "Don't take it personally," when something is deeply personal. I quietly asked whether everyone else had attended. He hesitated before admitting Vanessa's parents were there, along with investors, local business owners, city officials, and several doctors from neighboring clinics. Even her younger brother had attended, but not me, not the man who paid his tuition when scholarships fell short, not the father who once slept inside his truck for 3 nights because motel money needed to go toward Daniel's exam fees. My chest felt tight as memories started replaying in my head like scenes from an old movie nobody else remembered anymore. I remembered the winter Linda sold her wedding bracelet because Daniel needed new medical textbooks. She cried quietly in the bedroom afterward because that bracelet had belonged to her mother. Daniel never even knew. We protected him from the ugly parts of sacrifice because we wanted him focused on his future, not our suffering. After Linda died 5 years earlier from heart failure, Daniel promised he would always take care of me. He stood beside her hospital bed, holding my shoulders while I cried harder than I ever had in my adult life. He looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Dad, you'll never be alone. I swear." But people change when money enters the room. Success changes people even faster. Vanessa especially changed after Daniel finished residency. When they first married, she acted respectful and warm. But once Daniel's income grew, something shifted inside her. Conversations became transactional. Family dinners became networking opportunities. She started correcting the way I dressed, the way I spoke, even the restaurants I chose when I offered to pay. One Thanksgiving, she laughed because I still use a flip phone. Everyone at the table laughed with her, except Daniel, who just stared down at his plate and stayed silent. That silence told me more than words ever could. And now, sitting alone in my quiet kitchen after learning I had been excluded from the clinic opening, I finally understood something painful. I had not simply been forgotten. I had been intentionally left out. I barely slept that night. I sat in my recliner with the television running on mute, while old memories kept circling through my head like ghosts refusing to leave. Around 2 in the morning, I walked into the garage and opened a dusty storage cabinet I hadn't touched in years. Inside were old photo albums, tax records, and faded folders labeled with Daniel's name in Linda's handwriting. I pulled everything onto the floor and started going through it piece by piece. Tuition receipts, loan documents, scholarship rejection letters, medical insurance bills. There were thousands upon thousands of dollars documented in those folders, most of it paid directly from our savings or borrowed against our home. Then I found something else. A small notebook Linda used to keep hidden in the kitchen drawer. Inside, she had written every sacrifice they made for Daniel's education. Skipped medication refilled this month. Delayed roof repairs. Sold mother's bracelet. Harold worked Christmas Eve double shift. Reading those lines felt like being punched repeatedly in the chest. My wife had quietly documented the price of our son's future while never once complaining about it. By sunrise, I realized something that disturbed me deeply. Daniel and Vanessa acted as though they built everything alone, but their success rested on sacrifices and no longer respected or even acknowledged. Later that afternoon, my old friend Walter stopped by unexpectedly. Walter and I had worked together driving trucks for nearly 20 years before he retired to Florida. He noticed immediately that something was wrong. I finally told someone the truth. I explained the clinic opening, the phone call, Vanessa's cold voice, and humiliation of learning strangers mattered more than family. Walter listened quietly before asking a question nobody had ever asked me directly. Harold, exactly how much money did you give that boy over the years? I shrugged at first, but he insisted we calculate it properly. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing old paperwork and records scattered across my dining table. Tuition assistance, rent payments, car insurance, emergency expenses, living costs during residency. The total shocked even me. Adjusted over the years, it was well over $400,000. Walter leaned back in his chair and stared at me for several seconds before speaking. And whose name is on the deed to that clinic building? I told him I assumed Daniel owned it jointly with investors. Walter slowly shook his head. No, Harold, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking who helped him secure the original financing. I frowned because suddenly I remembered something I had not thought about in years. During Daniel's final residency year, the bank had refused his first business loan application because he lacked assets. I had stepped in quietly and used my house as collateral to help guarantee part of the financing package. My house, the home Linda and I spent 40 years paying off. The room suddenly felt colder as the realization settled into my chest. If things ever went wrong financially, I was still tied to that clinic, whether Daniel acknowledged it or not. And for the first time in my life, I began wondering whether my son valued me only when he needed something from me. The next morning, I drove across town to the clinic for the first time. I had seen photographs online, but standing in front of the actual building felt different. The place was enormous. Modern glass walls, polished stone entrance, expensive landscaping, and a giant sign that read Bennett Advanced Medical Center. My last name stood 10 feet high above the entrance, yet somehow I had never felt more invisible in my life. Luxury cars filled the parking lot, while professionally dressed employees moved in and out carrying coffee and folders. Everything looked expensive, successful, important. I sat inside my old pickup truck for nearly 10 minutes before finally walking toward the entrance. The young receptionist behind the front desk smiled politely at first, but the expression faded when I introduced myself as Daniel's father. She looked nervous immediately and said Daniel was currently unavailable. I calmly explained that I would wait. A few minutes later, Vanessa appeared from the hallway wearing an elegant white blazer and high heels like she owned the entire building personally. The smile on her face vanished the second she saw me sitting in the lobby. "Harold," she said tightly, "you should have called before coming." I stood slowly and looked around the massive lobby. Crystal lighting fixtures hung from the ceiling, while patients sat on expensive leather furniture beside a decorative waterfall built into the wall. I asked quietly, "So this is what all those sacrifices turned into?" Vanessa crossed her arms immediately. "I really don't think this is a place for emotional conversations." That sentence told me everything about how she viewed me. Not family, not Daniel's father, just an inconvenience that threatened professional image she'd carefully constructed. I asked if Daniel could spare 5 minutes to speak with me privately. She hesitated before finally leading me toward his office. When I walked inside, Daniel looked surprised and uncomfortable at the same time. His office alone was larger than my entire living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, while framed awards covered the walls behind his desk. He hugged me quickly, but it felt forced, distracted, like a businessman greeting someone he did not have time for. I asked him directly why I had been excluded from the opening ceremony. He sighed heavily and rubbed his forehead before giving the same answer again about investors and business networking. Then he said something that changed everything between us forever. "Dad, you don't really fit into this environment anymore." The room went completely silent. Even Vanessa stopped moving behind me. I stared at my son, waiting for him to correct himself. But he didn't. He continued speaking carefully, almost like rehearsed corporate language. He explained that many of the people involved with the clinic came from wealthy backgrounds and professional circles. He said appearances mattered in business. That image mattered. Then he gently suggested that maybe my old truck driver background and simple lifestyle did not align with the image they wanted during the grand opening. For a moment, I genuinely could not breathe properly. I had spent my entire life believing honest work carried dignity. But standing there inside that expensive office, listening to my own son describe me like an embarrassment he needed hidden from wealthy investors, I realized something painful. Daniel had not merely forgotten where he came from. He had become ashamed of it. I looked at my son for a long time without saying a word. The strange part was not the anger. It was the disappointment. Anger burns hot and fast, but disappointment settles deep inside your chest like cold concrete. I kept thinking about Linda, about how proud she used to be whenever Daniel walked into a room wearing his medical school jacket. She would have defended him even now. She always believed people could lose their way temporarily. But standing inside that office, watching Vanessa nod quietly beside him while he explained how I no longer fit the image, I realized this was not temporary confusion. This was who they had become. I asked Daniel one simple question. "Do you know why I drove trucks instead of going to college myself?" He looked confused and shook his head. I told him the truth he had never bothered asking about. When I was 19, my father died suddenly from a factory accident. I had 2 younger sisters and a mother working part-time at a diner. College stopped, matching the moment survival entered the room. So I worked 12-hour shifts, weekend routes, holidays, anything that kept food on the table. I explained that people like me built lives through sacrifice, not image. Then I pointed toward the clinic window, overlooking the parking lot. "Everything you see out there exists because your mother and I spent our lives making sure you never had to struggle the way we did." Daniel's expression hardened slightly, almost offensively. "Dad, I appreciate everything you did, but you can't keep holding it over my head forever." That sentence hit harder than anything Vanessa had said, because I had never once asked for repayment. Not financially, not emotionally. Parents are supposed to help their children succeed. But basic respect is not repayment. Being included in your son's biggest life achievement is not a transaction. It is humanity. Vanessa stepped forward and calmly said they had enormous pressure managing investors, expansion plans, and public perception. Then she added something that exposed exactly how she viewed me. Successful people have to make difficult social decisions sometimes. Social decisions. That was her phrase for excluding family members who no longer matched their status. I suddenly noticed framed photographs arranged behind Daniel's desk. Pictures from the grand opening ceremony. Politicians shaking hands. Investors smiling. Vanessa's parents standing proudly beside the ribbon-cutting stage. Even her brother appeared in several pictures holding champagne. But there was not one photograph of Linda anywhere in the office. Not one picture of the woman who sacrificed her health, helping him become a doctor. I walked over slowly and looked at every frame carefully before asking, "Did you even mention your mother during the opening speech?" Daniel avoided eye contact. That silence gave me the answer immediately. Something inside me changed permanently at that moment. For years, I had excused every small insult because I believed family eventually finds its way back together. But this was different. They had erased the very people who built the foundation beneath their success. And for the first time in my life, I stopped feeling guilty for what I was about to do next. When I left the clinic that afternoon, I did not argue, yell, or threaten anyone. That surprised Vanessa the most. She expected emotion. She expected an old man reacting emotionally so they could dismiss me as bitter or unstable. Instead, I calmly walked through the lobby, got into my truck, and drove straight to the bank. During the drive, my mind kept replaying one sentence over and over. You don't fit into this environment anymore. After everything Linda and I sacrificed, our son had reduced us to an embarrassment that no longer matched his social image. By the time I parked outside the bank, my disappointment had hardened into clarity. I met with an old financial advisor named Richard Coleman, a man who had known our family for nearly 25 years. Richard greeted me warmly at first, but his expression changed when he saw the paperwork I placed on his desk. I asked him to review every document connected to the clinic loan guarantee I had signed years earlier. After nearly an hour of reviewing files, Richard leaned back slowly and removed his glasses. "Harold," he said carefully, "do you realize you still hold partial liability through collateral agreement?" I nodded quietly. "Can I remove myself?" He studied the documents again before answering. "Legally, yes, but if you withdraw your collateral support now, the bank could force a restructuring review. Depending on their cash flow, it could create serious pressure on the clinic." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Richard asked a question carefully. "Are you planning to do that?" I looked out the office window toward the busy street below. People move through their day without realizing how quickly family bonds can collapse once respect disappears. I told him I had not made a final decision yet, but for the first time, I wanted options. Real options. Richard then explained something Daniel clearly hoped I never understood fully. The clinic expansion had been aggressive. Too aggressive. Daniel and Vanessa borrowed heavily to create the appearance of immediate success. Expensive equipment leases, luxury interiors, high-interest investor obligations, public image spending. According to the numbers, the clinic looked impressive from the outside, but carried enormous financial pressure underneath. One serious disruption could destabilize everything. Suddenly, the reason for Vanessa's obsession with image became obvious. They were not simply wealthy professionals enjoying success. They were balancing an empire built on debt and appearances. As Richard continued reviewing documents, he paused again before pulling out another file connected to my house. "Harold," he said quietly, "there's something else you should know." My stomach tightened immediately. He explained that 6 months earlier, Daniel had attempted to increase the collateral exposure connected to the clinic expansion project. Additional paperwork had been submitted using my original guarantee structure, but the bank rejected it because my direct signature was required. I stared at him in disbelief. Daniel had attempted to leverage my home again without even discussing it with me first. Richard slid the unsigned paperwork across the desk. There it was. Expansion financing request worth nearly $2 million. My house listed again as supporting collateral. My hand shook slightly as I read through the pages. In that moment, something inside me finally broke completely. This was no longer about hurt feelings or disrespect. My son and his wife viewed me as a financial tool, useful when needed, embarrassing when visible, disposable when inconvenient. And sitting there inside that quiet office, I made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. That evening, I drove home slower than usual. My hand stayed tight on the steering wheel while my mind replayed every conversation I had ignored over the years. Every moment Vanessa subtly pushed me aside. Every time Daniel stayed silent instead of defending me. Looking back now, the signs had always been there. I simply refuse to see them because parents spend their lives protecting the image they have of their children, even when reality starts cracking that image apart. When I arrived home, I walked directly into Linda's old sewing room. I had not changed much since her death. Her reading glasses still rested beside the lamp near the chair where she used to sit every evening. Some people call that unhealthy. I call it remembering. I sat there for nearly an hour staring at her photograph on the shelf. Then I said something aloud I never imagined saying in my life. He became ashamed of us, Linda. Hearing those words out loud made the truth impossible to deny anymore. The next morning, I contacted an attorney named Margaret Ellis. She specialized in financial liability and estate protection. After reviewing my documents carefully, she confirmed everything Richard had warned me about. Legally, I had every right to withdraw my collateral guarantee from future obligations connected to the clinic. More importantly, Daniel's attempted expansion paperwork, without my knowledge, created serious ethical concerns, even if technically no fraud occurred because the bank stopped the process before approval. Margaret asked whether I intended to confront my son directly. I told her no. I was done with emotional conversations. From now on, everything would happen formally, legally, and in writing. She nodded slowly and began preparing the withdrawal documents immediately. Over the next several days, I learned far more about Daniel and Vanessa's finances than I ever wanted to know. Their lifestyle was largely financed through leverage and appearance, luxury vehicles leased under business accounts, a massive home purchase with adjustable financing, investor expectations demanding rapid expansion, social circles built around wealth projection instead of stability. The entire structure depended on maintaining the illusion of constant upward success. And underneath all of it sat one uncomfortable truth they never expected me to discover. My collateral support helped keep lenders confident during the clinic's early growth phase. Removing that confidence would create panic very quickly. A week later, Margaret officially submitted the withdrawal notice to the bank. By law, the bank had notified Daniel immediately. I did not call him afterward. I did not warn him. I simply waited. The phone rang the next morning at exactly 6:12 a.m. Daniel sounded completely different from the confident businessman I saw at the clinic. His voice carried panic now. "Dad, what is this?" he demanded. "Why would you do this without talking to me first?" I sat calmly at my kitchen table drinking coffee, while he spoke faster and louder with every sentence. He explained that the bank scheduled an emergency review meeting. Investors were already asking questions. Certain expansion plans could freeze temporarily until liability restructuring was completed. Finally, after several minutes of panic, he asked the only question that truly mattered. "Are you trying to destroy me?" I remained silent for a moment before answering carefully. "No, Daniel. I'm protecting myself." He immediately accused me of overreacting emotionally because of the clinic opening situation. But this was no longer emotional. Emotions fade. Documentation remains. I calmly told him I discovered the attempted expansion paperwork using my house as collateral again without my knowledge. The silence on the phone became immediate and heavy. Then he quietly admitted Vanessa, suggested moving quickly because they assumed I would eventually agree anyway. That sentence told me everything. They never planned to ask respectfully. They planned to pressure me afterward once the process was already moving. Daniel's voice softened then, almost desperate now. He said the clinic could suffer serious financial consequences if investors lost confidence. Employees could panic. Expansion contracts could collapse. His entire future was suddenly at risk. For years, I had feared disappointing my son. But listening to him panic over money while never once apologizing for humiliating me, I realized something painful. He was not afraid of losing his father. He was afraid of losing his lifestyle. Over the next few days, the situation inside the clinic started unraveling faster than even I expected. Investors became nervous once the bank initiated its financial review. Expansion contractors delayed agreements. Rumors spread quietly through the staff. Daniel kept calling repeatedly, sometimes 6 or 7 times a day. But I stopped answering most of them. After years of being treated like background furniture in his life, I refused to become important only during a financial emergency. Then Vanessa called me directly for the first time in months. Her voice sounded controlled at first, but underneath it I could hear panic. She said we needed to meet privately as a family to resolve misunderstandings before things became irreversible. That word almost made me laugh. Family suddenly mattered again now that banks and investors were involved. We agreed to meet at a restaurant near the waterfront the following evening. When I arrived, both of them were already sitting at the table. Daniel looked exhausted. dark circles under his eyes, wrinkled shirt, constantly checking his phone. Vanessa still looked polished and composed, but the confidence I once saw in her had cracks now. The second I sat down, she switched into negotiation mode. She explained how many employees depended on the clinic, how patients could suffer if expansion projects failed, how damaging public instability could become for their reputation. Not once during the first 15 minutes did either of them mention my feelings, Linda's sacrifices, or the humiliation they caused. Everything centered around risk management and financial damage. Finally, I interrupted and asked a simple question. Do either of you actually regret what you did? Silence filled the table immediately. Daniel looked down while Vanessa carefully chose her words like a lawyer preparing testimony. Then she said, "We regret that your feelings were hurt." That was the moment I knew nothing inside them had truly changed. People who feel genuine remorse speak about what they did wrong. Manipulative people speak about your reaction to what they did. I stood up slowly, reached into my jacket pocket, and placed an envelope on the table. Daniel looked confused until he opened it. Inside were copies of every financial sacrifice Linda and I made for his education over nearly 20 years. Tuition receipts, mortgage refinancing documents, medical bills Linda delayed paying, notes written in her own handwriting about skipped medications and extra work shifts. Daniel's face slowly changed as he turned each page. For the first time in years, he looked less like a wealthy doctor and more like the young boy who once cried after failing a chemistry test in high school. His hands actually trembled when he reached the page about Linda selling her mother's bracelet. "Mom did this," he whispered quietly. I nodded. "And she never told you because she wanted you focused on becoming successful, not guilty." Vanessa stayed silent now, completely silent. I leaned forward slightly and looked directly at my son. "Do you know what hurts the most, Daniel? It's not the clinic opening. It's realizing your mother gave away pieces of her life so you could rise higher, and once you got there, you erased her from a story." Daniel suddenly covered his face with one hand as emotion finally broke through the polished professional mask he had worn for years. But I wasn't finished. I calmly told him that respect cannot exist only when money is involved. Family is not something you hide from wealthy investors because they drive old trucks or wear inexpensive clothes. Then I told him the hardest truth I had accepted myself. You didn't become successful because you were better than where you came from. You became successful because two ordinary people destroyed themselves making sure you had opportunities they never had. Daniel started crying quietly at the table. Real crying, not performance, not strategy. But Vanessa still looked conflicted, almost trapped between protecting their image and confronting reality. And at that moment, I realized the real battle inside this family had never been about money at all. It was about whether success had completely replaced gratitude. For several minutes, nobody at the table spoke. The sound of the restaurant continued around us. Glasses clinking, quiet conversations, waiters moving between tables. But inside that small corner booth, it felt like time had stopped completely. Daniel kept staring at the documents spread across the table, like he was seeing his own life for the first time. I watched his expression change with every page. Confusion, shame, regret, maybe even horror. Because sacrifice feels abstract until you see it documented in black ink. Eventually, Daniel looked up at me with tears still in his eyes and asked a question I had waited years to hear. "Why didn't you ever tell me how bad things really were?" I leaned back slowly and answered honestly. "Because your mother and I never wanted you carrying our struggles on your shoulders. We wanted you focused on building a future bigger than ours." He nodded slowly while rubbing his face with both hands. Then he whispered something that hit me harder than I expected. I think somewhere along the way, I started believing I built everything myself. That was the first truly honest sentence I had heard from my son in years. Success had surrounded him with people constantly praising his intelligence, his ambition, his accomplishments. Over time, those compliments became a new reality where the foundation beneath his success slowly disappeared from memory. Vanessa finally spoke again, but her voice sounded quieter now, less controlled. She admitted she grew up believing appearances determined opportunity. Her own parents constantly judge people based on status, neighborhoods, clothing, and connections. She said she genuinely believed protecting the clinic's image was necessary for survival in wealthy professional circles. Then she looked directly at me and admitted something I never expected her to say. I thought keeping certain people away would help Daniel look more successful. Certain people. She could barely say the words aloud. But at least now she recognized how ugly they sounded. I told her calmly that real success built on shame eventually collapses under its own weight. Because once you start hiding the people who sacrifice for you, nothing you build feels honest anymore. Daniel suddenly pushed the papers aside and looked directly at me. Dad, I'm sorry. Not polished, not corporate, not rehearsed. Just simple and broken. Then he said something else that surprised even Vanessa. I became the kind of man Mom would have hated. Hearing that sentence out loud finally cracked something open inside me, too. Because despite everything, he was still my son. Hurt people can still recognize what they became. The question is whether they change afterward or simply regret getting caught. Daniel then told me the truth about the clinic finances. The business was under enormous pressure. Investors demanded aggressive growth. And Vanessa constantly pushed expansion because they feared appearing weak compared to competing medical groups. Over time, their entire marriage became centered around maintaining an image of unstoppable success. Bigger house, better events, wealthier connections, more visibility. He admitted the clinic opening became less about celebrating achievement and more about impressing people with money and influence. And somewhere inside that obsession, they quietly removed anything that did not fit the image they wanted displayed, including me, including Linda's memory. For the first time that evening, Vanessa's eyes filled with tears, too. She admitted she never truly understood what kind of people Linda and I were, because she spent years viewing us through the lens of status instead of character. Then she quietly apologized for the sentence she said on the phone. It wasn't really a family thing. I looked at both of them sitting there across the table, exhausted, ashamed, emotionally stripped down without protection of wealth or status. And I realized revenge had already done its job, not because their finances suffered, not because investors panicked, but because for the first time in years, they were finally forced to confront the truth about themselves. And sometimes, the most painful punishment is seeing clearly who you became. Daniel called again 2 days later and asked me to come to the clinic. He said he wanted to fix things properly and not just end the situation with an apology over dinner. I agreed, but I made it clear there would be no negotiation about the financial withdrawal. That decision was already finalized and irreversible. When I arrived, the clinic looked different. The same glass building, same polished lobby, same expensive design, but the atmosphere had changed. Staff moved more cautiously. Conversations were quieter. The confidence that once filled the space had been replaced with uncertainty. Daniel met me at the entrance himself this time. No Vanessa beside him. No receptionist interruption. He walked me through the corridor in silence until we reached the conference room. Inside were folders, financial reports, and documents spread across a large table. He explained that the bank had frozen parts of the planned expansion pending full reassessment of liabilities. Investors were requesting guarantees. Contractors were delaying schedules. The structure they built on leverage was now under pressure. Then he said something direct. I understand why you did it. That was progress, but not resolution. Understanding consequences is not the same as correcting behavior. Vanessa arrived a few minutes later. She looked less composed than before. No blazer this time. Just plain professional clothing. She did not try to defend anything. She simply said she had been reviewing everything and realized how much she misjudged the situation for years. Then she turned to me and said something I did not expect. Linda should have been honored that day, not excluded. That statement was the first genuine acknowledgement I had heard from her, not framed as business pressure, not justified by image concerns, just recognition of wrongdoing. Daniel then asked if there was anything at all that could repair what had been broken. I answered without hesitation. You cannot repair time. You cannot repair exclusion. And you cannot rewrite history to remove discomfort. The room went silent again. Then I continued. But you can decide whether you continue repeating the same values that caused it. I told them I was not interested in controlling the clinic, the finances, or their decisions. I was interested in whether they could operate without erasing the people who made their success possible. Daniel nodded slowly. Vanessa followed. There was no dramatic resolution, no emotional reconciliation moment, just acknowledgement that something fundamental had been broken and could not simply be undone with apologies or money. Before leaving, I handed Daniel one final envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Linda. He had never read it before. It was written shortly before she passed away. In it, she spoke about pride, not in achievements, but in character. She wrote that success without humility eventually becomes emptiness. She wrote that the most important part of raising a child is not what they become, but what they remember about the people who helped them become it. Daniel did not open the envelope immediately. He just held it tightly in both hands while staring at it for a long time. As I walked out of the clinic for the last time that day, I understood something clearly. I did not lose a son because of money or business decisions. I lost him the moment recognition was replaced with status, and whether he finds his way back or not is no longer something I can control, only something I can observe from a distance.